¿Empezamos? ¿O ustedes nos dicen? Buenos días. Esto es la primera edición del podcast de la Cátedra UNESCO en Estudios del Futuro de la UAM Coajimalpa, que vamos a transmitir regularmente para mostrar nuestro trabajo alrededor de los estudios del futuro en la unidad. Esta primera sesión tenemos el gusto de tener como invitado a Jonathon Keats de la Universidad de Arizona y de varias otras universidades, quien es un colaborador ya permanente de nuestra área y de las actividades de la cátedra. Vamos a conducir esta entrevista en inglés, por lo que ahora voy a cambiar del español al inglés. Welcome, Jonathon, again to our university, and thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your experience in all our activities here.
I'm delighted to be back in Mexico City, back at UAM, making more mischief.
So instead of introducing yourself, I would like to ask you, how would you introduce yourself? As an artist, as a philosopher, as an inventor, or as something else?
I've come to call myself an experimental philosopher, and it's it's a strategic move on my part, I think, to take this job title because nobody knows what an experimental philosopher does, least of all myself. I'm always confounded by what I do for a living, and that keeps everything far more interesting for me. My background is in philosophy in a more conventional sense, but I fled academia as quickly as I could and went out into the world trying to figure out how to do philosophy in public, how to make philosophy a means by which to activate thought at scale through thought experiments in particular, by setting up conditions, counterfactuals, alternative realities, possible futures, and bringing those into real time and space in the city or wherever I can get away with it in order to be able to interact with people according to these possibilities, to be able to collectively investigate, explore what we are as a species, as a people, as a planet, and what we might want to become, really leaving it fully open-ended in terms of the exploration, because I don't have any answers, and philosophers tend to have too many. I think that that's why I had to get out of academia in order to find my way back in, and find my way back in by being able to do these sorts of experiments here at UAM.
Are there any direct connections to the body of knowledge that we recognize as philosophy? What is your relation? What is the relationship between let's say more academic philosophy and thought experience?
Well, the thought experiment, as I undertake it, is definitely not the way that it's done in academia. I have taken it not as a rhetorical device, as a mode of argumentation, but genuinely as an experiment. That is to say, to take up a hypothesis and then to set up conditions in which the conclusions are not foretold. They are not anything at all predictable. And that's what makes it interesting. I would say that if there's any practice that fits within the realm of academia, or more broadly, this world in which we live, I have worked a lot within art as a way in which to do philosophy. That is to say, not making paintings or sculpture, but art research. The idea that art can be a way in which to ask big questions and to address those questions without the specific demands and limitations of any given discipline. In a sense, it's multidisciplinary, but I would think of it more as being metadisciplinary, that it doesn't really require that I have any particular set of professional standards that I'm applying in terms of a thought experiment, in terms of an exploration. But in terms of how I go about this, I think that it is essential to be rigorous in terms of creating conditions very carefully and being very specific in terms of how those conditions are applied and what we can learn from interactions that happen within the possibility space that I seek to create.
Now, we are particularly in our efforts to introduce future studies, we are very much interested in learning to including your proposals into academic programs. So what do we have to how can this be done? How can we make bridges between the more formal ways of using philosophical perceptions, of using different kinds of methods? How can we connect the more established forms of teaching and learning with the experiments you are proposing?
I think it happens at multiple levels. One of them is my own listening, my own learning. That is to say, I'm always attentive to research happening within academia, and I tend to work with scientists and with economists and with people who are within academia in a traditional sense, doing research in traditional ways. That this is material with which I work, but also these are people with whom I collaborate. And I think that the first part of what I have to offer, if I have anything to offer at all, is the ability to work across these many different disciplines because I'm in conversation with many of them at once, and to hear something in one field that might be applicable or appropriate or provocative or discomforting in another. So one aspect of my work is that I am interrogating the process of accumulation of knowledge and the methodologies underlying that within different academic disciplines. I think that another level is the level of engagement, which is both pedagogical and also in terms of research, to be able to come up with alternative methodologies that are responding to the problems or the questions that arise within different disciplines. And of course, in the case of future studies, this is inherently interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary in the first place, but where I can potentially work across practices as well as across knowledge spaces. Or in other words, bringing a workshop where people are working with their hands with materials that we've bought from Fantasia Miguel or that we found at a flea market, having people work with these materials in in physical terms to explore ideas, where this is a learning experience, ideally, for those who are participating, but it also provides research because we can understand the different perspectives and different knowledges that people have, the different bodies of knowledge that they bring to bear that may not be accessible or may not be comprehensible through traditional academic discourse.
So what specific role does the future play in these inquiries? Are your the exploration of the boundaries, let's say, of the way we can imagine the future, is this a central part of your proposal?
All that we really have to work with is the future. I haven't yet managed to build a time machine to be able to work with the past, except as a matter of archaeology, in metaphorical terms, perhaps more than in literal terms, interrogating history, trying to learn from history. But what interests me especially is the potential to improve our decision-making by virtue of considering possibilities and their implications ahead of when those implications will have bearing in some irrevocable way on our lives. And I think that the thought experiment is particularly well attuned, particularly well set up for that sort of work, because essentially what I'm doing in a thought experiment is I'm asking what if. I am trying to speculate and bring others into the speculative process with a materiality, with a specificity that ideally will encourage people to take seriously the consequences of decisions that they might make before they've made them, and then to take that knowledge, to take that experience, to take heuristics that might come from that practice, and to have that available not only as possibilities explored that can potentially be deployed when the time is right, but also experience at speculation, experience with this process of considering what the implications are of actions that we take. One really important part of this, I think, is the investigation, the interrogation of our assumptions. So often, the way in which we act is based on habit, both in the sense of the social structures that we inhabit, and also in terms of the cognitive structures that we've inherited and that we grow accustomed to. These are certainly useful, and it's essential to know them, to understand them. But it's, I think, equally important to be able to step out of those assumptions, at least enough to be able to ask whether they are good assumptions, whether they've ever been any good, whether they've ever been valid, but also, perhaps more pertinent to your question, whether they remain valid and whether they're likely to over the long term. So the move is both one that is looking within ourselves individually, looking within our society as well, which is essentially the work of history, a personal history and history writ large, and trying to make sense of that, but with the position that is taken being one of trying to apply that to questions that are either imminent or that are intuited in the farther future, where the broader scope of understanding that we can bring, which is not only the assumptions that we have, but also the imagination that allows us creatively to have possibilities, alternatives that maybe have never been the case and might never be the case, but to have those available as a way in which to check the momentum of the moment and to consider the degree to which it's appropriate, the degree to which it's desirable, or the degree to which we want to strive for something else.
So looking at your projects and at the topics of the workshops, one can find a very broad variety of aspects of that are being treated in a systematic way through your these formats of thought experience, like modern humane ethics, like topics like climate change, or new forms of governance. So can you explain to us how you find these topics and how you develop them, and if there's things that are connectors between these topics?
I think that the topics find me. I think that I'm living my life interested in everything. Curiosity is really what got me into this game, what is underlying this gambit. My own curiosity about everything. And as a result, I encounter current events. I'm out in the world. I'm talking to people. And I am taking it all in. And I'm not especially disciplined. So as a result, it all gets muddled and all turns into new possibilities that are permutations on what I find around me. So what I try to do is to take in what seems most interesting to me and what seems most perplexing as well, and to figure out how that all fits together and what knowledge systems are needed to be able to probe whatever it is that is perplexing me on the basis of what is interesting me and what I'm learning. So I am trying my best to research rigorously all the many fields that are underlying what I'm questioning. And I think that ultimately everything is related. That's a bit of a cliche, but cliches are cliches because they're true. I think that I take more seriously than some people the fact that everything is related. I take that cliche more seriously than others might by trying not to narrow the question, not to filter out the myriad dimensions that seem like they potentially are not so important, that they're not so relevant. I try instead to keep as open a mind as possible in terms of letting in all of the associations, all the ways in which ideas and all the ways in which experiences connect, or that they might connect. And then I take those connections and I work with them. And I use those connections as a basis for developing new projects where sometimes one thing leads to another. And that's very much, I think, been my experience here at UAM, working with you, taking ideas that came from one realm and finding others that might benefit from that line of inquiry and the ways in which that line of inquiry might work. So looking at cuisine in terms of climate change, and then starting to look at architecture as well and urban planning. One question leads to another. One method leads to another. One set of possibilities seems to require that others be considered. And they're all really in dialogue. They're all in conversation, at least in my head. And I try to make that conversation happen in the world.
So now this time here, we've been offering 4 different kinds of four workshops. So I would like to ask you to explain one of these and walk us through its content and what happens there. For example, the one we just finished on climate adapted cultural heritage in architecture, or another one.
Well, I mean, maybe we should start with that one because I alluded to it, and I'm sure that it's somewhat mysterious, the mention that I've just given. So climate change changes everything. It has an impact on our lives in so many ways. And we tend to think about it primarily in tangible ways that are about how infrastructure starts to fail, starts to fall apart as a result of the weather conditions changing, becoming more stormy, becoming more erratic, as well as the heat going up. So I started talking some years back with an applied ecologist, trying to understand how applied ecology looks at climate and looks at climate change, and learned about climate analog modeling, which is a technique that is used to make predictions about flora and fauna in the future in a given environment by determining other environments, other places that in the world today have a climate similar to the anticipated climate for the place that is being investigated. In other words, by taking the climate projections that have been developed by the UN and by others, and by looking at current climate conditions globally, it's a matter of matching a place that, in terms of humidity, in terms of temperature through the seasons, is currently experiencing what you'll experience in, say, 60 or 70 years. So I got very interested in this and was also interested in how climate change, in terms of the conversations that we're having, was missing another aspect of infrastructure that seems at least as important as the physical infrastructure. And that is our cultural infrastructure. That is to say, the ways in which we relate as a society, the ways in which we, as a matter of our identity, as a matter of our community, we manage to get along in the world. We have the sort of resilience that gets us through hard times. Climate change will make everything a lot harder. And so as a result, that cultural infrastructure becomes more important. So initially I started thinking about this in terms of food and foodways, thinking about how the meals that we share and the foods that we know are so important to our sense of self and our communities. And so I started to think about how we could adapt the foods that we know, our cultural heritage in terms of culinary heritage, based on ingredients that grow in analog locations, or in other words, ingredients that will be more viable in your home region in the future that are already grown someplace else, to start to look at building a list of ingredients and also to start building the know-how to be able to grow and to cook with them. So this became the basis for Tasting Tomorrow, a project that we've been working on at UAM for the past couple of years now, working in the cafeteria as well as working in people's homes on workshops that get into culinary heritage and thinking about the foods that matter to you and what matters in terms of the flavors, in terms of the textures, and how to preserve those, growing ingredients and using ingredients that will not be problematic in terms of the water, in terms of the energy that would be required to grow them in the future, using alternative ingredients instead. So more recently, here at UAM and also in collaboration with the Fraunhofer Institute for Building Physics and with partners at other universities, we've been expanding this to think about houses in relation to home. So home is similar, I believe, to food in terms of how important it is at the level of who we are and how we relate to others. Home being distinct from house. So the workshop that we undertook today was an investigation of home in relation to the houses in which we live, looking forward in time using climate analog modeling. So I asked people to make their house out of cardboard boxes and packing materials and various artifacts that had been picked up at flea markets and at hardware stores, and to create some sort of a model that then they could use as a basis for highlighting the aspects of their house that they consider most important in terms of what they think of as home. And after doing that, I introduced a climate analog location, which is the Sana'a region of Yemen. And we looked at Yemeni architecture, traditional architecture of Yemen, and I asked people to take attributes of architecture from Yemen, including the mud brick walls and the larger aperture of windows on higher levels in the towers that are characteristic of building in Sana'a. I asked people to take their house and preserve as much as they could of home while modifying the house physically with those materials, bringing in attributes that would make their house more livable in terms of climate going forward without the requirement of air conditioning and other factors that would only exacerbate climate change, but without disrupting the qualities that make house a home. And this is, I think, really important because so often architects and planners come in and they change things without thinking about people's needs. And people feel disenfranchised, people feel alienated, people feel like they have no agency, like they have no part in this. And it tends to happen at the last minute or after. So what I'm attempting to do with a workshop like this is simultaneously to learn from people in a way that can potentially inform building code and can inform architecture going forward within Mexico City on the basis of what we've learned not only from Yemen, but also what we've learned from people in terms of what they value. And at the same time, what I'm hoping is that this will help to bring about that capacity to imagine possible futures and to play a role, to take responsibility, to be a part of the changes that need to be made, but also to be assertive of what needs to be preserved, to be fully immersed in this transition, in this transformation that needs to take place, so that it's a transformation that, of all the possibilities that could potentially be catastrophic, that it is as good a transition as we can possibly achieve.
One of the perspectives that we are using as from the chair, the point of view of the chair, the research program at the chair is looking at the specific perspectives that have been developed in the global south towards imagining futures. What is your impression? What have you found in during the activities that you've been developing in Mexico about the particularities, regional, cultural particularities, and their relation with the South, and that might be different from approaches that are dominant in the North, and the way we relate these to each other. There's a lot of debate about the decolonization of the futures. What is your impression in terms of the particularities in Mexico?
Many of the workshops I've undertaken and much of the research that underlies those workshops, I've also done these activities. I've also undertaken these investigations elsewhere in the U.S. and in Europe in particular. And I think that one thing that stands out, and there's a lot, one thing that stands out immediately is an informality and an inventiveness that comes out of improvisation, of possibilities, where I think that there is a tendency in the global north to have solutions that are accepted by virtue of the expertise that has brought those solutions into being, and a technocratic attempt to apply them without real consideration of how they relate to what it is to be alive, to what actually matters in terms of the lives that we lead, the lives that we live. I think that here I have found, first of all, a much more intuitive sense that any change needs to take into account the totality of life. And secondly, that change is not necessarily going to be a matter of expertise that can be applied or a system that is given and that must be taken in totality. Instead, I find that there is a willingness and eagerness to try out different possibilities and to find out through that effort, to find out what they might mean and what they might do. I think that happens here quite naturally, in that the workshops that I lead here tend to lead. The workshops I undertake here tend to need far less prompting, in the sense of trying to encourage people to experiment, to explore. I think that it is really intuitive on people's part to do that work. And this is something that I think the global north desperately needs to learn, and can learn potentially through exposure to what is happening here. Partly this is a matter of conditions that are inherently more challenging economically here than they have been in the global north. Partly it's a matter of the power dynamic and the fact that there's been a disparity, there's been an asymmetry in terms of power, and there's been a need to get by in a way here that has not been the case so much in the global north. So partly I think that it's a matter of those often unfortunate historical facts and the consequences of those of that history, leading to a greater capacity to contend with the uncertainties and with the challenges that come up through climate change and the Anthropocene more broadly. Partly, though, I think that it also is cultural and seems to be especially the case in my experience here in Mexico City, a matter of people who are living quite close to each other and trying to figure it out and doing so from day to day in a way that is naturally applied in an academic setting, naturally applied in terms of trying to solve problems of governance, trying to solve problems that relate to climate change, mass extinction, and all the rest. There's simply not so much of a separation that needs to be undermined, needs to be dissolved, needs to be challenged. So the work I have to do here is a lot easier. It's a lot more fun as well, because we can get to the part that is creative and the part that is that can get a little bit crazy in ways that I think are really generative, but also that people can have a lot of fun and can laugh and can get away from the sorts of concerns that often trap us, that often prevent us from considering what we actually want, what we actually care about.
That seems to me a really important point. But how can we strengthen the awareness and the consciousness of this potential, or to build alternative ways, in creative ways, using open designs, using creativity? What would be ways to strengthen that? Can we go broadening the tools we have with what we call futures literacy? What would be your proposal? What would you suggest? How to broaden these capacities and to get to maybe also a form of imagination of futures that comes more from within and not so much this trying to look and copy futures from other places?
I think that it is active. I think that it is a matter of activating and then standing back, or perhaps engaging in dialogue with the unexpected, with what might seem at the outset to be chaotic, what might seem like it is totally disorganized and directionless, but actually is exploratory. So I think that one attribute that certainly I have learned for myself is trust. I think that I started working here in Mexico City with some experience in the US and in Europe that was problematized by the fact that control in the way I was accustomed to simply didn't seem feasible. And I think that initially I didn't fully trust the instincts and the inclinations of the people I was working with here. And it took a little bit of time to learn how to work within an inquiry that was difficult to define or to describe or to explain initially, that was difficult to organize or to coordinate initially. I think that recognizing that the creation of initial conditions is important, but it's equally important to let go once those initial conditions have been set out, and to allow the inquiry to be self-determining at some level. And this is something that I have tried to bring back with me to the global north, tried to encourage a little bit more of this open-endedness in terms of process. I've always thought of myself as being open-minded in terms of seeking questions as opposed to answers, and trying to find deeper questions even when answers seemed to come up from the work that I was doing. But I think that that's only part of it. I think that another part of it is in the process itself, which is to say that it is a matter of letting the thought experiment in its own right, letting the question, letting the initial conditions potentially become other than what they were intended to be, because they might well turn out to be more interesting, and they're probably going to be more relevant. So certainly bringing more people from the global north to the global south, people who are doing any of the sort of work that is related to the future, ranging from engineers to artists, I think that that can be really powerful, because I think that this is a process, a learning process that happens in situ, that happens through the interaction. I don't know that it really can be achieved in any other way. It certainly can be described, it can be written about, it can be encouraged, but I think that it is in this place, in its totality, that comes through, and that capacity then gets carried north. So that seems like it's a part of it. And then another part of it, I think, is simply to show off what is happening here in terms of the imaginative capacity that is largely lacking in the U.S. and so often in Europe as well, to make Mexico the envy of the world. I mean, I'm deeply in envy of what happens here and very much want to be involved, very much want to encourage it. I think that this is something that people can learn through coming here, but I think that it also can be projected in terms of the writing, in terms of the art and its exhibition, in terms of the architecture, in terms of the technology, the methodology itself. All of this, I think, can be exported in ways that may not entirely be applicable, in the case of technology, for instance, to conditions in the global north, but can be an impetus to do the sort of work there that is done here, and ideally to pay back in terms of recognizing that work is being done here, to pay back in the sense of supporting the institutions and the people who are doing this work, and also to to consider how the political conditions that have been so lopsided in ways that have disadvantaged Mexico City, Mexico, the global South, they need to be corrected. They need to be they need to be approached, and they need to lead to different economic and political dynamics from those that we currently are experiencing.
Do you think that the current forms of imagination of futures are too much dominated by dystopic ideas, that we have lost in a way to have a more broader idea of possible futures, and that we need to strengthen the idea to look at positive alternatives and to open to more like long-run ideas, long-term ideas in that sense?
I think that dystopia is a problem. I think utopia is also a problem. I think that when we impose a model and then we seek evidence to support that model, or we seek to create conditions that make that model inevitable, that's going to get us into trouble. It's going to get us into trouble in the case of dystopian futures because by virtue of their being dystopian, these are futures that we don't want. On the other hand, with respect to utopian futures, they are potentially putting first a dream that is important to have, but is important to have with a critical evaluation of what that dream requires to bring into being and what it entails that may not be part of what was initially dreamt. So that the utopian impulse is also, and perhaps equally problematic, when we try to bring that utopia into being in toto. I think that what instead we need to be doing is we need to be learning to ask better questions. We need to begin with curiosity, begin by observing and by discussing what we find around us, and then by creatively engaging what we find and by imagining and by experimenting with permutations, I think that we can find ways in which to dream where the dream is situated in the world, emerges from the world in which we live and all the experiences that we have that can inform the fullness of that dream, and that we will, by virtue of the fact that we have tangibly and collectively gone through this process, have the communal level of engagement, of inquiry, and of initiative that are essential for this dream of one not to be alienating to others, for this dream not to become other people's nightmare. In other words, for utopia, for me not to become your dystopia, or vice versa. So I think that the experiential process, the experiencing of the imagination collectively in terms of the recognition of all that we have around us, both what we appreciate and what we wish were not the case. And by the ability to recombine in terms of the materiality and in terms of the discourse, all that there is in the world today, we can emerge in a place where we have a strong sense of what we are wishing for, and also a consensus in terms of bringing about that possible future.
What are your current projects and aspirations? What are your the projects that you are working on, or the other ones that are on your mind for the next workshops and the next activities, steps?
I'm especially interested in democracy and all of the ways in which democracy seems to be failing us, and all the ways in which we can come to consensus that are beyond the system, the capacity of the systems that we currently have, systems that seem to no longer be achieving what they set out to accomplish. And I'm interested in who is involved in the democratic decision-making process most of all. I think that to a great extent, why we find ourselves in the conditions that we do now, that is to say, for the sake of paraphrasing, why we find ourselves in the Anthropocene, I think that this has to do with the fact that we have, as humans, decided that we have all the answers, and we have used the power that we have accumulated to inflict our delusions on everybody else and on the planet as a whole, on all other life, where other life forms are deeply informed about what is happening in the world in terms of what they sense and how they make sense of their experiences. And where that is missing is, I think, to a great extent, where we, in our hubris and in our myopia, where we make decisions that are ill-informed, that are short-sighted, that are self-centered. So I'm interested in exploring what it would mean, what it would take to broaden democracy, to enfranchise others, ultimately all life on Earth, to be involved in this process of collective decision-making. This seems to me right if democracy is ethical, and I believe that it is, as a proposition in which all who are affected by a decision have a say in making it, because non-human species are very much affected by the decisions that we make. So the logic of democracy at an ethical level seems to demand that we enlarge the scope to include non-human others. But I think that also at a pragmatic level, at the level of democracy as a computation, democracy as a system by which to make the best decision, to optimize for conditions, and to be able to do so iteratively as conditions change. This is a sort of a wisdom of the masses that becomes wiser as we enlarge who we consider to be a part of the mass perspective that is integrated into the policies and into the policy decisions that we make. So what I am trying to do is to figure out how we approach that, and how we do so in practical terms, as well as what it means philosophically, because I think that we need to be undertaking both inquiries simultaneously. I think that we need to be trying out ideas, possibilities, before we commit ourselves to any one of them, lest we end up with the bacteria, who by sheer numbers are very much in the majority, potentially deciding that humans are expendable and that we ought to be brought to extinction. I'm not in favor of that. But I do think the bacteria have a lot to tell us. I think that we have a lot to gain by being in conversation with bacteria and with plants and with other animals. And we have a lot to gain by thinking of the body politic as including all. So this is a project in the broadest sense of the word that involves many thought experiments that I think will be especially exciting to explore here in Mexico City, a place that is very much an urban forest, or that has many urban forests, and that has an incredible biodiversity. If we could think about within Mexico City how all life can work together toward deciding what makes for a better city, I think that we'll have a model for how to do this in other places, and perhaps even at the scale of nation states and even at a planetary level. So I'm excited about the prospect, for instance, of opening up a polling agency for the plants, for the trees of Mexico City, where we are evaluating changes in their stress level over time. Essentially, in the U.S., we have an expression, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, as what's at the back of people's minds when they go to the polls to vote for the president. Basically, this is a question about stress. Are you getting more stressed or less so as a result of the policies of the previous administration? Stress is something that is measurable in all species. And so what I am thinking about already and discussing with people at UAM as well as at other schools within Mexico City and also with people in government here is the possibility of activating citizen pollsters, people who go out into the urban forests of Mexico City and who are observing the plants in terms of their stress level and changes in stress level. For instance, whether the plants are flowering more early in the season, which tends to be an indicator of higher stress, or whether the foliage is decreasing from year to year. This becomes a way in which to integrate the perspective of non-human others into political decision-making in ways that could be binding in the future, where that could be a way in which they vote, but even in the present, which can inform human voters, sensitizing people who participate in this to their climate, to their environment, in ways that can be more extensive, but also by taking those data and by disseminating them, by taking the polling agency as a basis for using media to communicate the political perspective of plants. This potentially becomes a way in which to activate within a much broader body politic of humans, within a much broader voting base, voting that is taking into account the perspective of these non-human others. It becomes a model for future action, but it also becomes a way in which to evaluate whether this is, in fact, an appropriate way to approach the problem of how to enfranchise others, whether, in fact, stress is relevant and whether it leads to decisions that actually are beneficial for all. I don't know. If I knew, then I wouldn't be proposing that we experiment. I think that the great virtue, the great interest for me in the thought experiment is that we can go into this not knowing, and we can be passionately agnostic in every sense of the word, in terms of this being an opportunity for all of us to learn and to learn together. So my hope is that going forward here in Mexico City, we are able here at UAM with the chair and also with collaborators to work at scale, to try to understand the political will of all life living in Mexico City, and that can become a paradigm coming from the global south, a paradigm for political action on a planetary level.
There's still so many topics. I think we could go on for several hours, but unfortunately we have to keep time here and get to an end. So I would again thank you so much for being here, for sharing all these inspiring ideas and your experience, your practices, and building and bringing into practice these thought experience. So thanks so much, Jonathon.
Thank you, Bruno, for inviting me here time and again. I'm looking forward to more.